Hi, this is Eric Pagli. I'm here in Tromsø, Norway for the Arctic Frontiers Conference, where we're recording a few special episodes of the Polar Geopolitics Podcast. Joining me for this session, we have Andreas Raspotnik, senior researcher at the Fridtjof Nansen Institute and a specialist in the European Union's interests and policies in the Arctic. Andreas, great to see you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
And we'll go right into your area of specialty, the EU and the Arctic. Quite a bit going on. There's a new EU Arctic strategy coming up later this year, which we'll get into in a moment. But first, has this Greenland crisis in some ways created an opportunity for the European Union to assert its leadership and interests in the Arctic? It seems like it's really taken a lead somehow in this sort of, I don't know if call it negotiations or this management of the situation between the United States, Kingdom of Denmark, and Greenland.
I really hope so. If you look at what the European Union, EU member states have done in the Arctic from this policy perspective, they almost go back 20 years. And we've just heard Norway's Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre talking about almost 20 years of Arctic frontiers. Him, when he was foreign minister, developing the Hano strategy, the first one for Norway. And then he mentioned also, the European Union published their first Arctic policy in 2008. So the European Union as an institutional actor goes back to the almost 20 years, and in that regard, it's not that we forget, but Europe is an Arctic stakeholder. The European Union is an Arctic stakeholder. European member states are in the Arctic. There's a big regulatory competence the EU has in the Arctic. There's economic linkages, environmental impacts, of course, people, research funding. So the EU is there. They have developed a policy since 2008. They have updated that policy regularly. Member states have done the same thing. What I was always, I wouldn't say criticizing, but I was questioning, you have a policy, but where are the actions? Where are the resources you put in? Not only external resources like research funding, but internally, having people working on the Arctic portfolio and etc. And then sometimes it is about what are the interests, what are the crises Europe has to deal with. And if we go back the last 20, 15 years, the crises, the main ones Europe had to deal with were rather in the south and the east. Financial crisis, migration crisis, Ukraine now, And you can always argue climate is the biggest crisis for very good reasons. But did it really make a difference in the Europe's perspective about the Arctic? And maybe not. And now with Greenland, that could change, and we have to see in the next months ahead if it becomes more substantial. But you could really see, more and more member states, in addition to the supranational level, the EU level, they're focusing on the Arctic and to try to understand it more comprehensively. Not only from that EU, call it soft power or whatever perspective, research, environmental issues, socioeconomic perspective, but also security. And we have to see on how substantial that is really in the long run. And here, sorry to interrupt, I think Europe has something to offer. We often forget and we often, make us smaller than we are. Europe is a continent of compromises. So we know that we have to talk to each other in order to achieve something, International law is key. Free trade leadership in the free trade thinking. There's something Europe can bring to the world. We are 400 million people. So the single market is a huge economic power horse. We see it with Mercosur. We see it now with the relations with India. There's something we can offer, particularly also then in the Arctic. But we have to think. It sounds a bit philosophical, but we have to be proud of ourselves as well, and who we are in the world, and then also be a bit more proactive and say, these are our interests, and we'll maybe see that with the new policy that the interests are about critical minerals, about offering something to Greenland that is based on international law, based on people's decision to decide their future, knowing that the EU is a complex entity, it's a flawed entity sometimes. The continent is a continent of compromises, so we work slowly in many ways, but maybe that's also the beauty we have to better sell.
I mean, oftentimes these days, the last few years, the Arctic, the geopolitics of the Arctic has been framed as a theater of great power competition between the United States, China, and Russia. How does the EU feel about this? Do they feel somehow marginalized, left out, kind of any sort of chip on their shoulder when it comes to this framing and not being taken perhaps seriously enough when it comes to their interests in the Arctic?
I guess the problem, but the story goes beyond the Arctic. It's about who are we as a continent in Europe? Who are we as Germans, as French, as Britons, as Polish, and how do we work together or not? And again, come back to that. we all have different interests, we have different identities, different histories, different cultures. So it is sometimes, a real challenge to achieve something. And as I said, this great power game is often very much focused on its military efforts or whatever. And Europe is, of course, a weaker actor in that regard. But there are other big powers, competences that we can offer. And of course, the economic market is one. Innovation, And I think, again, we struggle a bit because we were so dependent on the US security-wise. We know that the cheap gas we got from Russia, and then, of course, our goods we sold to China, and that was a very comfortable place to live in. And now everything is changing, in so many fronts. So we have to deal with these changes and also try to convince our citizens to, move forward together, hopefully, and not like fall back to some kind of nationalism and, split up apart. And in the Arctic, again, maybe peripheral for EU policy and stakeholders because the crises have been somewhere else, but maybe that changes now. And maybe then we can also make policymakers aware that, yes, Greenland may be a wake-up call, let's talk in a year about, but there are other crises as well up here, and opportunities in the Arctic, for Europe, and Prime Minister Sturda mentioned it, and of course it's the resources, it's the related potentials up here, but then we have to take into account what can we actually offer that is based on the needs up here, and you be a proactive stakeholder and act in that regard.
And do you see there being any sort of tug of war right now between the United States and the European Union over Greenland, maybe other parts of the Arctic as well, in terms of critical natural resource supply chains and so forth? It seems like there's maybe it's been framed so much as the United States wanting to exclude China, but is there also any tensions between European access to the resources of Greenland, European access to other parts of the supply chain when it comes to the Arctic?
I mean, it could well be. Again, here Europe is waking up that catchphrase or hashtag strategic autonomy. We have to become independent, and some of those resources that make us more independent from China, but also from the US, are located in the north. We often forget it's also the European Arctic, Kiruna, the Norwegian Arctic, the Swedish-Finnish Arctic that has a lot of resources in that regard, minerals, and it's not only Greenland. But Greenland is part of that game, to say it like that, and the EU has opened a mission there in Nuuk, also trying to better understand what are the minerals opportunities there. But then again, the EU is a political actor. They can provide certain regulations that would help European companies, together with the Greenlanders, to be active there. But it's a long-term game, and you have to think, I would also, a bit more strategically, okay, how can we make sure, again, if Europe is so much about environmental protection as well, trying to balance, classic sustainability thing, how can we do it the European way that it is, if we do it, it helps our interests together with our partners, hopefully, but also, for the advantage of the Greenlandic people. And again, here the EU invests a lot in Greenland, education, health, a lot of money is also put here in Greenland, but it has to be, maybe go beyond that, that we say, okay, I'm not talking about a membership option, but that, okay, we have something to offer in Greenland, in Europe, and whatever you decide for yourself, together with the people of Denmark and within the Danish realm, don't forget about us, and knowing how controversial the history has been, between the EU and indigenous people in the Arctic, on several fronts, but then again, it's...
European countries have also been sending military assets to Greenland during this crisis, and that was quite controversial, maybe misinterpreted these sort of signals being sent from Europe towards Washington. Of course, this would be more of a NATO matter as opposed to the EU, but how are European countries thinking about national defense, military security when it comes to the Arctic and Greenland in particular?
It's not really my cup of tea per se, but what you see, and here Donald Trump had an impact. European states are raising their spending. So when it comes to military defense issues, again, we have heard Prime Minister Sturda saying, they try to reach 5% in a couple of years, and other states have done so as well. Particularly Denmark, for example. We see that the story is a complex one. Look at Germany. Like what is the future of the military in Germany with such a controversial and bad history in many ways, But again, it will be a long shot in Europe because you have to change societies, but again, maybe, the last few weeks or year in the Arctic, and even further, February 2022, the Russia's war against Ukraine is changing in the long term, The question is always like, you spend more money on security, you probably miss it somewhere else, And how can you, again, convince the whole of society that, we try to balance our spending and have to maybe think a bit more in a security setting in this changing world, knowing that it is rather uncomfortable discussions for many Europeans.
I mean, now in the end of this year, it's supposed to be a new European Union Arctic policy published. Right now, it's a sort of commentary period. Do you have any insight into what direction the European Union is going in the Arctic in terms of what sort of policies and priorities they'll have?
Very basic, like the three main pillars of the EU's Arctic policy have always been climate change, impacts of climate change and all related research efforts, the socio-economic development of the European Arctic, and keeping the Arctic a peaceful space of international cooperation. That has been like the three main pillars of the Arctic policy since 2008. And I think it will look similar in that regard. But of course, as also High Representative Kaja Kallas said here, Arctic security will be key. And here, I think there will be a bit more of a comprehensive approach to security. There's military aspects, of course, but particularly as economic security. We'll see a lot of Greenland in there. We'll see minerals in there, for sure. Maybe we also see some debates about shipping and the broader, the so-called hotter topics in the public sphere when it comes to the Arctic in addition. And I think you can always, as analysts, we then criticize what's lacking and what's missing. But in an effort to understand the Arctic of today and make it a bit more of a comprehensive picture, I think we'll see more on Greenland, more on critical minerals. And hopefully, an Arctic policy, it doesn't matter if it's the EU or others, normally I always argue it's an umbrella policy of 15, 20 pages. And then you have to see on how the Arctic and all these related matters to the Arctic are also connected to other major policies, Green Deal issues, the global strategy idea of the EU. How is the Arctic also understood outside the Arctic and internally? And that is my main criticism recently, that it's fine to have a policy, it's fine to be more interested also in the public, on a broader level, but we have to put resources, human resources, spend money in the bureaucracy so people can better understand the Arctic, place the Arctic within all these ministerial settings, the EU settings, maybe not under a security pillar or under a fisheries pillar, maybe make it a distinct pillar, the Arctic. And we all know that's complex, You do a podcast on Arctic geopolitics, polar geopolitics. The Arctic is here, it's a different Arctic than the Canadian Arctic. So it's tricky to bring it all together, and the EU has more competences here in Europe, obviously, than in Alaska. But I think it's very dangerous that you have a policy, but you don't have enough people to work on a policy, or then the policy is moved around between security, research, fisheries. It's a problem to keep it, focused.
Right. I mean, the European Union has not always been a very welcome actor in the Arctic, even amongst its own member countries. I think that there's been some idea that the European Union might try to interfere or take certain authority away from individual countries, not to mention other non-European countries like Russia and Canada even have not been welcoming to the EU even as an observer to the Arctic Council. Do you see that as changing? Is the Greenland crisis maybe made European Union more welcomed by the Kingdom of Denmark, maybe by other European countries, to sort of as a counterbalance to what's happening on the other side of the Atlantic?
You're completely right. Again, it's not an Arctic issue. It's an EU, a European issue. What kind of competences do you give to the supranational level and take away from the member states, from the national level? And of course, in the Arctic here, again, I think the EU has a lot of competences due to their treaties and to who the EU is in matters of research, biodiversity, those kind of issues, but not in those great power thinking matters. And again, we'll have to see if that is changing. But so far, always all kind of strategies by member states are emphasizing the EU, sometimes more than less, but the Finns have always been very proactive when it comes to more EU involvement. The Swedes is a bit of a different game, because I would always argue Swedish is, that's maybe also changing, but it's always been more Baltic oriented state than an Arctic one, Norway obviously outside. Denmark, again, very much about the Greenland, the Nuuk Copenhagen issue, and then the problems with the EU. But it's a sign that Kaja Kallas was here, she wasn't here before, and you can say it's maybe a coincidence or not, because then also Greenland happened before she probably agreed to come here. But we'll have to see if that becomes again more substantial with the update of the policy this year, and then see, okay, will actually the member states agree on what what the Commission and the External Action Service conclude? But I'm optimistic. And you see the Parliament also, they are very active again to push for more comprehensive engagement, to maybe think not only about the Arctic, but of a bigger European space that, starts from the Baltics into the Arctic, and then you have totally different actors involved as well, more actively Germany, Poland, the Baltics, of course, and in the French, and maybe in the long run, even the UK. And I think that is what is, in addition to the policy, and now again I've become a bit more of a political scientist, of a philosopher here, but we need an idea. We need a narrative that we can offer to the North, and so far that has been lacking. If you go back in history, when Finland and Sweden joined the EU, 1995, from our then President of Finland, Paavo Lipponen, or was he Prime Minister, he came up with the idea of the Northern Dimension. So how can you bring the Northern orbit into EU thinking? You have the South, you have the East, you have the transatlantic relationship, but what about the North? And then in the positive time, Barents Cooperation. From the beginning there, the EU was very active here. And now this is all like gone, more or less. The Northern Dimension as a policy, as an initiative, doesn't exist anymore. So we need a new story, a new narrative of how to bring the North also closer to the continent.
It needs to be a positive narrative.
It is a positive narrative. And what could that be? I mean, Europe is, I wouldn't say saturated sometimes, but as Western societies, we achieved a lot of things over the last 100 years, So what is our story now for the future? And I think that goes beyond, again, the Arctic. I mean, how can we convince the citizens that what we have is worth keeping? And, institutions have flaws, but whatever. But the very main idea that we should work together in Europe is a great one. And how can we sell that idea? What is the positive story ahead that goes beyond bureaucratic technical language, and research funding spending there, and some EU logos somewhere, you need a bigger, better story.
What about leadership? I mean, terms of, if it's just Brussels bureaucrats making policies, maybe that's not so inspiring, but like Macron has been running around speaking Greenlandic and so forth. I mean, Kaja Kallas being here in Arctic Frontiers. Is there any national leaders or European Union leaders that could perhaps carry this mantle of leadership that would maybe make the European efforts in the Arctic more cohesive?
I think at least those interested in Europe are waiting for such a leader. Somebody that goes, that moves a bit beyond national borders. And you mentioned President Macron. I think he had that vision maybe for himself, and maybe he could have also reached more. We all know that he's a bit of a lame duck in France itself, but I think he could have been. Even Friedrich Merz could have been such a person, but I don't see it really, and he doesn't have the charisma, I would say. And then it's a bit tricky, to who could that be? I mean, the UK has left. Maybe a Brit could have been. Could a Spanish be the person? Could a Polish be that person? I mean,
but you're not mentioning anybody from the actual the European Arctic. No Swedish leader, Finnish leader.
We now are very positive towards Finnish President Stubb, but again, how many people know him outside the Arctic world and outside, the intellectual world? I mean, he's a super smart person. He knows how to talk. He's a diplomat, in many ways. But I don't see him being, or I haven't heard anything about him moving beyond, trying to bring Europeans together. Yeah, but you're completely right. A story needs proper leadership, somebody to, and I think Europe would be ready for somebody that, like, what? Again, we have something to offer, and we don't need to talk about the United States of Europe happening in 5 years, but we should understand we're better together, and then we can also have a positive influence in this changing Arctic.
I mean, just to wrap things up, Andreas, it's been a really interesting discussion. A couple of weeks ago, in sort of the heat of this Greenland crisis, Europe was very prominent. Different expressions of solidarity from the EU, from Nordic leaders. Now there's this other process, which maybe is not so open. This working group between United States, Greenland, and Denmark. Is there still a continued EU role to play in this crisis, whichever trajectory it takes in the next few days, few weeks, few months? Is the European Union still involved or just monitoring from a distance?
That's a good question. I mean, I would argue, I would think they are definitely monitoring the situation and maybe try to keep it a bit low, the discussions now. Okay, not at least on a bureaucratic level, but knowing what's going on. But I think from a more active level, again, you have a mission in Greenland, you can offer things, and you work on certain agreements, on how to, again, maybe spend money more effectively, whatever it is, And I think, again, I was criticizing before, saying it's good to have a policy, but you need to actionize it, And here you just keep on working. And European diplomats the networks are the channels are open. So I'm pretty sure other diplomats from other countries will know what they will be discussed, at least to some extent, and then we'll have to see how to react, But again, if things changes maybe to the worse again, hopefully not, but what would be our argument? And then here again, it's like we have something to offer. And again, things maybe hopefully not get worse, but if they do, look at Europe, and we've heard that from the Greenlanders in very clear and loud, we stand with Greenland, with the Kingdom of Denmark, with Copenhagen, but the Prime Minister said we stand with the European Union, and that is something new I haven't heard before in that kind of loud and clear language. So I'm pretty sure, we'll be aware of what's happening, but actively we will not see like loud voices if things remain like this. But then that still doesn't mean you shouldn't do anything, and there's a lot of things you can do.
What about in terms of the transatlantic relationship between the European Union and the United States? I mean, is this more of a NATO issue since the United States is actually a member of NATO, or is there some sort of back channel discussions, you think, or some ways to keep this from really creating this schism between the United States and Europe?
I mean, obviously, I could talk about Greenland very much to some extent a NATO issue, but then I think, again, what Prime Minister Sturda mentioned in meeting President Trump, I mean, what can leaders in Europe do to tell the story our correct way, And then, of course, you have an opponent, he needs to understand it and accept it, But I think diplomatic efforts are the key thing Europe can do and should continue to do so on not only the highest level, but also on the lower minister and a bureaucratic level. I'm saying, you know what, this is us, we have red lines, and you have been our closest ally, but we try to become more independent on so many levels, and we are the leaders when it comes to understanding international law, working around international law. This is us, so be proud of who we are. And I think on the diplomatic level, this is hopefully continuing, and not becoming.
Well, Andreas, fantastic to finally have the chance to speak to you. I've been meaning to talk to you here in the podcast for years, and glad to finally have the opportunity here at the Arctic Frontiers Conference in Tromsø, Norway. So thanks very much for joining us on the podcast, and hopefully to have you on perhaps later in the year when the Arctic, the new EU Arctic policy is published.
Thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you.